is that really the drive for the continued practice of FGM and cutting girls and young women is really embedded in the patriarchal notion of what it means to be a woman and the ideals of motherhood later on, right? And so I think it's in terms of the expectations or the reason for why it's I mean, from my own, as an African feminist, it's very problematic, right? Because it's really about controlling women's autonomy, controlling women's bodies, being able to decide whether they should have sexual pleasure or not, whether
Right.
they should engage in premarital sex or not.
Hello, welcome to the Famous podcast. I'm Françoise and I'm really pleased today to welcome Satang Nabaneh to our conversation. Satang is an academic, legal scholar, as well as a human rights practitioner. She is originally from the Gambia, but now divides her time between the United States and South Africa. She holds positions at the School of Law of the University of Dayton in Ohio, as well as at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She is one of the foremost experts on harmful traditional practices in Africa, and particularly on female genital mutilation. And very recently, she edited and wrote a book called Female Genital Mutilation in Africa, The Politics of Criminalization, where she and her co-authors explore the topic of female genital mutilation and whether the use of criminal law is effective in combating this practice. Let's hear from Satang. Hello, Satang. It's a real pleasure to have you on the Famous podcast. And today, I want to speak about your work. You're a legal scholar and expert on human rights, women's rights in Africa, and you just recently wrote and edited a volume called FGM in Africa, Politics of Criminalization, where you really, with your co-authors, really dig into this subject matter. And I want to explore with you today what this is all about. I just came back from your home country, the Gambia, where I was last week, where I heard a lot about the battle there to stop female genital mutilation, and it's a real struggle. So let's just lay the context around the world, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa. The practice of female genital mutilation is still remarkably persistent, and as noted in the preface of the book on FGM in Africa that you edited and wrote, the stark reality is that despite increasing legal prohibitions against FGM across Africa, the harmful practice persists, affecting over 230 million girls and women globally, with an estimated 92 million in Africa aged 10 and above. So that's 92 million girls and women living today in Africa who have been affected by this practice. So if you don't mind, to start, for my listeners who are not very familiar with this topic, could you help us define what is female genital mutilation so we understand what we're talking about? What is it? Who performs it? Who are the persons subjected to it?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me on the podcast. Pretty exciting. And I'm
Our
just super,
pleasure.
as you know, I'm super excited that you got to go to the Gambia. So we have to debrief at some point. But many thanks again for having me on the podcast and yes, we're super excited about the recent publication of our open access book, which has been in the works for the past couple of years. You wouldn't, wouldn't know the drama behind it. Thank you. It's beautiful. And we're going to do the launch next week. But just coming back to your question and just contextualizing it, right? So, I mean, when we talk about female genital mutilation, some people call it female genital cutting, some people call it female circumcision. I know we'll talk about the legal framework, but this also is seen even in the variety of the names is also seen even as the prohibition of FGM within the African context and globally goes up, right? we do not have to get into it, but naming it female genital mutilation itself is political and it's contested, right?
Right.
I come from a human rights background, which obviously with that framework really takes FGM as a human rights violation, as one that is contrary to ensuring the autonomy of women and girls and so forth. And so in my thinking, in my engagement, in my advocacy, use the term female genital mutilation, but obviously acknowledging that there is a variety of names associated with it. So when we think about female genital mutilation or FGM, we have a number of definitions, but obviously the World Health Organization, the WHO, has a broad context of what FGM is. And it was actually interesting that recently I attended a webinar launch where they were launching guidelines on addressing FGM for healthcare providers, right? Because, I mean, that's also the conversation about what aligns with or what should go along with legal responses to FGM, right? But aside conversation anyway. But FGM really broadly, when we talk about it, it includes all sorts of procedures that involves whether they're partial or the total removal of all the external female genitalia, right? For non-medical reasons. And non-medical reasons should be the underlying context here, right? Usually it's performed without the consent of the victims or the survivors, and we'll talk about what that is, because there is obviously a whole lot of conversation as now as to who do we determine as the victims and the survivors of FGM. And when we talk about FGM as well, there's always, the categorization of the 4 types. Type 1, the partial removal, type 2, the total removal of the female genitalia, part 3 or type 3, when what we call infibulation as well, which really is the sealing of the, for example, the vaginal opening, right? And then type 4, which refers to other harmful procedures, is very vague. Also open to debate, right? Because that's also where the conversation comes in as to whether what we know especially on this side of the wall, female genital cosmetic surgery falls under that ambit. But anyway, also to say as well, especially with the types, when you look at it, the types also happen in various places within the African context. There are certain countries that have type 1, some type 2, some type 3 as well. Traditionally, when we look at female genital mutilation, who does the act or who does the cutting itself, because it was seen as a rite of passage, traditional practice. We used to still have in certain communities traditional circumcises, right? These are usually older women, within the community, within those practicing communities, who then use crude tools, right? Razor blades and other things. I don't want to be graphic, to do the cutting within a non-medical context, right? And then in terms of the victims or who used to be cut, right? Especially with the rites of passage, it was that it was seen as this transition from childhood to adulthood, and so teenage girls, for instance, will be taken to a certain secluded place and be cut and taught traditions and cultures. But we do know, and that's part of what will be our conversation. That part of the backlash, especially with the legal responses, is that now cutting is done as early as when a baby, right? So we've had incidences in the Gambia where, right, a 3 months or 4 months old baby was cut, right? So we've also seen that sort of reaction, the early cutting, which then there is a difference in terms of the trend, in terms of age, as to who is cut in that process. But not to be very scientific or technical, that is the broader definition and the types, as well as the folks that have been cut and involved in the process.
And what do we know about the consequences for the girls who have been cut? There's, I assume, health consequences of having your external genitals removed by a traditional practitioner, and later on, when these girls and women are pregnant. I mean, what are some of the consequences?
Yeah. So I mean, and I mean, there is evidence, obviously, but not enough evidence, especially for certain contexts, right? Where scientific research is difficult to get. But from the broader context and the data that comes from the hospitals and the other research that have been done, as you rightly said, the medical consequences or the health consequences are huge, in terms of the I mean, for instance, have friends and colleagues who have explained their terrible and horrible experiences when giving childbirth, for instance, right? I mean, immediately, obviously, with the cutting in a non-medical setting, for instance, or in places that are not hygienic, we have the infections, and sometimes it leads to other in the worst case scenario, obviously loss of life, right? In that sense, right? But there are also hidden consequences that we do not know enough about, or we do not talk about much, right? So, for instance, one of the consequences, I mean, obviously, the mental health issue is there that's not talked about enough,
Sure.
especially within the African context, in terms of the ongoing trauma from, and for some people, right, they were cut from the age of 6 years, right? But they live with that trauma for the rest of their lives, right? And in one of the specific areas that we've seen that is really around this idea of how they do not, for instance, enjoy sexual pleasure, right?
Right.
Due to the fact that majority of their genitalia has been cut, and the trauma of that, the ongoing, the ongoing feeling around that, and so it really prevents them. And we do know that sexual pleasure is a human right, right? I mean,
Right.
it's about
Exactly.
but body autonomy, right? So I think that's one instance. But also, what we've also seen as well is um, the other consequences as well, as I said, especially within the medical space, is regard to trauma, but also I think part of the challenge as well is that even with some of the types, right? So, for example, let's talk about infibulation, right? So this is ceiling. What we've also realized and have seen is that, for instance, when somebody is infibulated, when they get on the night of the wedding, for
Yeah.
instance, because some of the arguments for female genital mutilation is that we want to, for example, those that support it want to prevent premarital sex and that kind of thing, right? But with the sealing, that also have meant that on the night of the wedding, in order to consummate the marriage, the victim then has to be recut, right? Because they
Oof.
were already sealed.
Yeah. You mean
And
sewn shut
from
or yeah.
yeah, exactly. Sure, right? So they have to be unsealed, right?
Goodness.
And in that unsealing, it's recutting in that process. But also there has been, whether evidence or anecdotal evidence that if you're unsealed that particular night, you actually then have to engage in the process. Otherwise, then I mean, it's your body, right? Then it gets resealed again, and you have to record again. So I mean, I think the ongoing, I think
Goodness.
part of, yeah, a part of what the evidence shows is that there is no medical benefits. There is no health benefit, positive health benefits to FGM. But as I said, part of what I think, even within the Gambian context, where we saw the pushback as well, was this that the pro FGM actors were like, "Can you show us evidence? Can you show up evidence of what the harm is?" Right? And so data and evidence also comes into play as people engage in the various processes of addressing FGM, whether that's the legal responses and the others as well.
So, given what you've described, infections at the time of the cutting,
Right.
difficulties in pregnancy and childbirth, of course, loss of sexual function, sexual pleasure, some pretty painful experiences, having sex with
Right.
your husband. So, it seems pretty negative on the whole. So, why does the practice persist and continue? What are the arguments that are used to justify it?
Right. And I did allude to that a little bit. But one is it's seen as a tradition, as a culture for certain practice and communities. I don't know that we're talking about FGM within the African context, but also recognizing that obviously we've seen it happening in other places as well. One where obviously we do have the immigrant communities as well, whether in Western Europe, North America, Australia, as well as others, right? But I think part of the broader motivations for the practice of FGM, just this idea that it's about purification of or purifying the girl that is transitioning from a girl to a woman, right? And so this idea that we are supposed to maintain the innocence of young women in order to so that when they're at the time of getting married, that they are pure, that they're not engaged in premarital sex, that sort of thing, right? But also, obviously, then there are quote unquote religious connotations to that as well, and which I'm happy to flesh out with you more as well. But I do think, and from the work that I have done, both in terms of the research, but also the advocacy as well, is that really the drive for the continued practice of FGM and cutting girls and young women is really embedded in the patriarchal notion of what it means to be a woman and the ideals of motherhood later on, right? And so I think it's in terms of the expectations or the reason for why it's very I mean, from my own, as an African feminist, it's very problematic, right? Because it's really about controlling women's autonomy, controlling women's bodies, being able to decide whether they should have sexual pleasure or not, whether they should engage in premarital sex or not. And so the motivations really around the idea of purity, around the idea of ensuring that the expectation that girls are supposed to align with the conceptions of what a particular practicing community in terms of their culture and values and norms, as well as those ideas, are really centers why FGM continues to happen, but also why people really drive or try to push for the practice as well.
One of the strategies that's been used across the world where the practice is prevalent to try to combat it has been the adoption of laws to criminalize, right, female genital mutilation. And this happened in the Gambia, for example, in 2015, when the law on women's rights was amended to include a ban, criminalization of FGM. How has that gone overall? Because what I heard when I was in the Gambia is that there was very little enforcement of the law, in fact. So is it working?
So that's what the whole book is about, right?
Yes.
Well,
in a nutshell.
Yes, in an attempt to, right? Because what we see within the Gambian context, and you're right, 2015 we had the law. We hardly had any prosecution until very recently, which then there was then that backlash that then led to the drive to decriminalize FGM as well. So the legal responses doesn't or the call for criminalization doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So we know that at the international level with the UN, there are calls and resolutions and things like that, but also particularly relevant for the African context is the Maputo Protocol, right? And the Maputo Protocol under Article 5 really delves into broadly on harmful practices, and obviously know that when we talk about harmful practice, it's not just FGM, right? But FGM tends to take up the space more, given the sort of privilege rate that we have within the continent.
And for those who don't know, the Maputo Protocol is the African level Convention on the Rights of Women in Africa, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
And draws a lot of inspiration from CEDAW, which is the UN one, or the global one. Yes, and so specifically the Maputo Protocol, for instance, calls for the criminalization of FGM, whether medical or not, right? So I think that's one of the call for what that looks like, right? In relation to the responses to FGM, and so I think what also tend to get lost is that it's the responses is not just one, right? So I mean, you have the societal responses, you have the public awareness, and all of that, which are actually all state obligation, for instance, under the Maputo Protocol in relation to responding to FGM. But coming back to the legal responses, what is happening in the Gambia, or continues to happen in the Gambia, is very true for a majority of countries within the African context. So we know that globally we have more than 60 countries that have criminalized FGM in one form or the other. Over 25 are within the African context. So that's huge, right? But also looking at obviously the prevalence rate that we already did mention at the beginning as well. What then tends to happen is, so we have the laws that criminalize FGM, and these I should note, and which we actually did in the introductory chapter of the book, was that it can be found in different places, right? So it's not necessary that a country just specifically has an anti-FGM law, right? So we do have those countries like Kenya, right? But then in most instances, majority of the African countries, in relation to the prohibition of FGM, can be found in different laws, right? Whether those are the sexual offenses laws, or the children's laws, or the penal code, so in variety
Right.
of laws as well. So that also means that the responses, even with the punishment differs, right? Some have imprisonment terms, some have fines, some are better than others in that sense, right? But I think what really the question then is with all of these laws that we have, which are great and which we're very good at within the African context, we do have nice
Good
cyber
laws.
laws. um, right. But then prosecution always becomes problematic, right? One is, it's just the way criminal law is set up in a way that, when we're coming up with laws that criminalize a certain act, right? And we do know that criminal law, in the way that it's structured, is very much focuses on the individual acts rather than the systemic, the systemic problems itself, or the systemic issues itself, right? Then means that there is already a limitation embedded into the criminal law itself, right? In a way that, even with the way that it's drafted and adopted, and this is true for a lot of things, but that mostly the people that are going to be affected by the criminal law are not really involved in the lawmaking, right? I know that that is a broader indictment on lawmaking itself, right? Where
Right.
obviously we know that it's more top down than bottom down, right? So that in the first place means that you do not really get the buy-in of the practicing communities, right? Which is problematic in itself, right? Because then you do not get the buy-in, and so that means that they're not in and then there is the need then for more engagement, and that's what we see in the Gambia, especially with the engagements with the practicing communities, the civil society organizations continue to do as well. But on the prosecution side, and especially with regard to who gets to, or who is responsible for ensuring that criminal law is enforced, right? Law enforcement agencies, the judicial systems, and so forth. These are also people, right?
Right.
That are sometimes part of those practicing communities, right? And so sometimes you go, and this is not just about FGM. I mean, it's a broader framework of gender-based violence. You go, you report a case, they'll be like, this is a family matter, go solve it, right? And then it means that both in terms of the reporting is low, because when we think about FGM and we think about individual acts, these are also people that are in the same communities, right? So, for instance, in the Gambia, with the baby that died a couple of years ago, it was the grandparents, for instance, that were involved, right? These are family members. So in most cases, families do not go and report, right? So there is already low reporting level. Then the whole process of investigating and prosecuting then becomes problematic. But then even when you go get into the judicial system itself, right, you also have judges and magistrates and others, right, who are not really au fait, right, with regard to women's rights issues. So I think really looking at the limitations of it is also on various different dimensions, right, given the sort of complexities to prosecuting, investigating, and punishing such acts that are so much embedded in our community as well. And so that is why also there is always this idea that, when we think about legal responses, which are absolutely vital, that it needs to go hand in hand with other approaches, right? So, for instance, there has always been that idea around the health approach in terms of speaking to the moral conscience of the communities, especially religious actors and the others who have influence in relation to the practice, right? I mean, part of the downside for that is what we've seen with the push for the medicalization of FGM, right? So that's the downside of the health approach, right? That that this is bad for the health of the woman, and then the response has been, oh, let's medicalize it, let's have a healthcare provider then do it
Perform it
in a safe,
instead.
hygienic,
Yeah.
exactly, right? Which we know that it's regardless of who gets to perform it, whether in a medical setting or not, it's a human rights violation. We also know, for instance, that FIGO, the Federation of obstetrics
Obstetrician.
and gynecologists,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, came out and said that given the sort of do no harm principle that healthcare providers, and this is true of even the recent WHO guidelines that came out, that healthcare providers are not right supposed to perform FGM. So that's
Right.
one, right? But then, yeah, then the other approach has also been this idea, because as I said in the beginning, right, that the practice of FGM is seen as in certain communities as a rite of passage, right? So there has been this idea around alternative rites of passage, in which is about going through the process but without the cutting itself, right? So we've seen this in Kenya, we've seen this in Senegal and other places that have been piloted as well. Obviously, it's a better approach in a sense, right? But there has also been pushback, especially from the feminist perspective, around this idea that the practice of FGM, as I said, itself is embedded in the patriarchal notion and ideals of what a woman should be, and ideas around motherhood. And so even reinforcing that and training girls to be right through those processes is, even though it's addressing the health concerns and the cutting itself, right? But it doesn't also address the normative concerns, probably, right, of this idea that you're in reinforcing the institution of the patriarchal institution
Right, right,
itself, right,
right, right. I
through the
mean,
alternative
what you're saying is
rites of
that the
passage.
whole
Yeah.
question of rites of passage needs to be examined, right? If the rites of
Right.
passage are to reinforce traditional notions
Right.
about motherhood and womanhood and all that, then maybe
Right.
it's not that great to just say, oh, we won't cut, but we'll still enforce all these norms, these gender norms that are in themselves harmful. Now let's get back
Right.
to the Gambia, where last
Mhm.
year there was a very difficult struggle to
Right.
preserve the criminalization of FGM in the law, the preserve the ban, right? Because there was actual, for once, enforcement where 3 women were actually arrested and fined because they had cut a young girl, and the the uproar that resulted caused one of the biggest battles in parliament that's been seen in a while in the Gambia. And there was a conservative imam who tried to convince parliamentarians to actually repeal the ban. Now, that didn't work in the end, but feminists and civil society organizations and the UN and international donors all came into the Gambia and said, no, 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 you can't repeal the ban. Yet, as you're describing it, it's not been that effective at reducing the practice. So why defend, a legal norm that's actually not that effective? What do you think was going on there?
Right. No, and I mean, and to say, even the naming of the title of the book itself, we had to make considerations, right? I mean, it was like at the beginning, it was like, oh, let's do limitations of criminalization, and then we said politics of criminalization, right? Because I think it goes to this very valid question, right? That you had as well. I think part of the reason why, part of it, well, I think the reason why, right, there was a lot of push to maintain the ban is, right, that there is a general agreement that legal responses are absolutely necessary, right? Obviously, as we said, right, whether they're effective is another question. One, they're supposed to, and this limitation also obviously goes to even the way, as I said, indicated before, alluded to, in terms of, whether they're whether the punishment are deterrent enough or not, right? So that's one part of, I think, the narrative, right? But also that even where the legal frameworks are not responsive, they do still serve a purpose, right? And I do think that's where the drive has been, to ensure that we do safeguard the gains that we made, especially around criminalization of FGM, regardless of whether it has been enforced or not. And that's why you saw the decry as well, right? But I also think, as part of for the global and the African feminist movement, I think we're usually caught by surprise in certain instances, right? The Gambia is one example, but Kenya obviously was another example, right? In this sense that, we push for criminalization of a certain act like FGM. We have the law in place. Obviously NGOs then even though it's not totally 100% their responsibility, then take up the public awareness and the engagement with the communities. Even though, as I indicated, even with the Maputo Protocol, it calls on African governments to ensure that gender sensitive, but also cultural relevant ways of engaging with the communities and changing behavior, right? Because you can have the laws, but if the behavior doesn't change, it doesn't make much of an impact, right? And so, as I said, part of the surprise for even with the Gambian context is this is a win, right? So we have the law in place, even though we haven't had prosecution in for a while, and then all of a sudden we had this drama. The same is true of Kenya, where they have a fantastic anti-FGM law. Prosecution has been happening in some way, and then all of a sudden, then a medical practitioner then went to the High Court to say this is violating my human rights because it doesn't allow for cutting off consented adult. I know there's a whole different debate, right? Because here within the Gambian context,
It's children, yeah.
Right, exactly. But also that these sort of politics around criminalization will come up because we haven't seen enough evidence, right? And I also think that's also and it takes me back to the point about the data and the evidence, right? Because even as we say, yeah, we're pushing for the criminalization, the enforcement, and so forth, we do need best practices in countries where it is working, right? So, for instance, Burkina Faso, for instance, have been given as an example, right, of where the anti-FGM law has been working, where prosecution has been high. I mean, obviously, we can debate as to what the implications of those are, especially thinking about the broader context of criminalization, as I said, and the use of criminal law, especially as it relates to women's rights issues, right? But one of the key things that really comes out of the Burkina example, right, is really around this idea of both in terms of the public engagement and awareness raising, in terms of the training of the people that are actually supposed to enforce the laws, right? But also in other instances as well, addressing some of the challenges as it relates to access to justice, right? So, for instance, instead of just relying on the quote unquote the permanent infrastructures of the court system in Burkina, they had the mobile legal clinics, right? Where then the mobile courts, right? Which then takes this to the people, right? Because it's also this idea that we're not just, because we know that in a lot of African countries that access to justice is very problematic and an issue for a lot of women, right? So dealing with that kind of process as well. So really thinking about innovative ways of how we ensure that the legal responses is emboldened in a way that it actually addresses the issues that it's supposed to, right? And so coming back to the Gambian context to say, yes, we haven't had prosecution, right? But what the FGM law then does is serve as an advocacy tool, right, for civil society, for the international community. And I do, if you've seen my conversation piece, when the FGM backlash happened, was also to know that the international community also has a role to play here, right? So a role to play here, not just necessarily about, yes, we're coming in, we're supporting the drafting and the adoption of a law, and then we're out, right? Because my observation is that, especially when we're dealing with practices such as FGM that are embedded in cultures and traditions, right? There really is, we need to have a theory of change, right? A theory of change in a sense, how do we move the needle from one point to another? And this instance is really also thinking about sustained ways of funding. That's not just about ticking off the checklist that we have a law and that's it, we're out, right? Exactly, right? That it needs to be a long-term strategy, right? A long-term strategy that's not just about building the capacity of the folks that are supposed to enforce the law in a way, engaging with the communities as to the importance of the law, but also the other social behavioral change mechanisms as well, but also in line with all the broader strategies, especially within country, that really builds the capacity of women and girls. Because there has been this push about how FGM could be end in a generation, right? So my generation, right, where we've been cut, but we know better, right? And so my 4-year-old will not be cut, right? So that's really breaking the cycle, right? Breaking the cycle. And the honest truth is, when you look at, and you've been in the Gambia, when you look at the Gambian demographic, more than 60% of the Gambian population are actually young people, right?
That's right.
So if we're, and that is why organizations like Think Young Women and others, right, are really focused on directly also engaging with young people as well, right? Because if they're able to break the cycle, then we're able to break FGM within a generation, even despite the embedded barriers and limitations within the criminal law system in relation to that.
Yeah, let's talk about young women in this context. You founded an
Sure.
organization called Think Young Women that is very active in the Gambia and it's fantastic, to really mobilize young women on a range of issues that concern them, right?
Right.
Their rights. And their bodily autonomy and so on. So, what was you thinking at the time? What motivated that when you were young and you said, we've got to do something?
Right, right. No, no. I mean, as I indicated, or I grew up in the activism space in the Gambia. I started as a child activist at the age of 8, and so was very much involved in the advocacy around the Children's Act of 2005, right? Which was fantastic, right? But which obviously was very much draws inspiration from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN one,
Right,
as well as the
right.
African one. And so, even though at that point it did have the prohibition around harmful practices, but we know that part of the global limitation, especially even though that has been addressed over the past couple of years with general comments and recommendations and that kind of thing, right, is that FGM itself wasn't named, right? So we had harmful prohibition of harmful practices, but not necessarily FGM. So we've seen that change, and which is very much welcome as well. So being in that space and working on a variety of issues, but also being very young, but in the women rights space, because I won't say feminist, because I think that's a whole different conversation. Because I'm sure when you were in Gambia, your engagement with the older the veterans, right, of the women rights movement wouldn't necessarily call themselves perhaps feminists, but the
Right,
younger people will.
right.
So there is also a generational difference in terms of that, and we can unpack that.
That's
But
a
anyway, let's
different
unpack that next
conversation,
time.
but yes.
But yeah, but that also meant that we were very much cognizant that even though you have the variety of women rights issues, right, so many land, property, women's political participation and representation and things like that, we were very much interested, especially around young women's leadership, right? But also ensuring that we're able to empower the present and the next generation of young women leaders in a way that they can speak to their own issues, right? But also centering those issues as well, because obviously with the generational difference, sometimes the issues that affect our generation might be different, might look different from the other generation as well, right? So that was really the motivation in time, because we were sort of back in 2010, the first organization that really focused around leadership by and for young women, and which has had a really great ripple effect with the Girls Agenda, with other young women's organizations that I'm sure you've met when you were in the Gambia as well. But a big part of that has been really this focus, both in terms of particularly engaging with practicing communities, right? Both practicing communities, but also especially with young people themselves, right? So practicing communities and continuously engaging with them, but just to perhaps focus on the engagement with young women, but also with boys and men as well, right? Around that and the variety of issues, whether that's female genital mutilation, but also child marriage as well as others. I think what has really been interesting, as I said, is really this idea around building the capacity of young women. I know the word empowerment itself is a loaded word now, right? But even as we think about the different approaches of responding to harmful practices, particularly FGM, whether that's legal responses, health, alternative, the other one is around empowerment, right? And empowerment here has to deal with both in terms of as we've been doing the girls mentorship program, where girls and adolescents are trained about their rights around sexual and reproductive health and rights, on bodily autonomy, being able to make informed decisions around issues that affect them. But also in addition to that as well, right, is really this idea around social and economic empowerment as well, right? And even political empowerment. So looking at empowerment in a variety of ways to say that, in addition to the other responses to FGM, that these are things that happen. But particularly for, and I'm very impressed with the approaches that civil society, particularly young women's organizations, are undertaking in the Gambia, right, around harnessing the digital space, but also the digital tools as well, right? Because that has been really great. As I said, we have a young Gambian population, right? That's one, but also the use of music and arts and theater, right? So, for instance, in 2017, Think Young Women brought together a group of artists, musicians, together trained them on different, women rights issues. After that, they did an album, Do No Harm album, that really was really focused around social justice issues, right? That really centered women rights issues, but also in a way that people respond to, right? Because if I came and I'm talking about FGM, I am bored, right?
Right.
But through music and arts, right, it really reaches the affected population. And one of the really nice ripple effects around that is that we've seen that group of artists actually now went ahead to set up their own NGO, really focus around how they use music for change, right? So it is these really small embedded ways of using the sort of innovative thinking and passion and creativity of the young people, right, to really engage as an alternative, well, not as an alternative, as a complementary way to the other approaches that we have, including the legal responses to FGM.
So there was good news last year, which is this
Yeah,
attempt to overturn the ban on FGM didn't succeed. I mean, parliamentarians, after much lobbying and education, did not repeal the ban. But now, of course, the extremists that are behind this attempt to
right.
overturn the ban are not, of course, they don't take no for an answer, right? So now they've gone to the Supreme Court of the Gambia to try to get a court ruling declaring that FGM violates their right to religious freedom and their cultural rights. So that's quite complicated because I think we all know that Islam does not mandate female genital cutting, for example.
Right.
It's not a practice in Saudi Arabia, the epicenter of Islam. So it's obviously something else that's going on in terms of cultural norms and, as you said, rites of passage and so on. But nevertheless, that's the argument they've gone to the Supreme Court with, that this violates their religious freedom and cultural rights. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think these arguments will have traction with the Supreme Court in the Gambia?
I hope not, especially in the Supreme Court, with regard to the FGM case, because we've seen really good jurisprudence or decisions coming out both from our neighbors within the African region, as well as the regional system as well, right? So specifically, as I did mention just briefly, with regard to the Kenya case, where then the High Court said that your right to culture wouldn't take precedence over your other fundamental rights that we're protecting here, right? And we've seen that also coming out of the African Court, which is the highest court within the African region, in the case of Mali back in 2018, as it relates to harmful practices, but specifically on child marriage around exemption, where an exemption was made for girls to be married before the age of 18, and which was different with the marriage age for boys. And specifically, the African Court then came out and said, just because this is a cultural practice, right, it doesn't take precedence, right? Cultural practices doesn't negate the obligation of states to ensure that the fundamental rights of girls and young women, especially as it relates to FGM, whether that's health or the sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as others, that it should not take precedence. And so I am hoping, and this is also the thinking behind the conversations, both within the Gambian context, but also regionally with the support of other civil society organizations, is to make these cases and show evidence as well to the courts that the argument that their right to culture is violated should not be the one that the court takes into account, but rather that the fundamental protection of girls and women, especially young women, within this process is to ensure that their rights, the protection of their rights, takes precedence over anybody else's arguments around culture.
Right, right. I mean, in other words, the rights of the community to practice their culture, which exist and have been enshrined in international law,
Correct.
do not supersede the rights of people to their
Correct.
bodily autonomy and security and safety and life in some cases, right? So there's
Correct.
got to
Yes.
be a way to
Yes.
figure this out, so that culture is not negated but does not actually then negate other rights, right?
Correct.
It's
Yes.
the challenge. Yes,
It is.
yes.
It is. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and part of that challenge as well is just also, and I mean, this brings us back to the conversation about criminal law, right? Is also to acknowledge that even as we, and as you know, I just came back from South Africa, and part of the conversation was how do we, or the thinking, it was an expert advisory group, right? Was thinking around how to do strategic litigation, especially related to obstetric violence. I know there's a whole nother conversation, right? But the disrespect that birthing persons obviously experience before, during, and after childbirth. But part of the conversation was how far should we use criminal law, right? As you know, part of my work that I do is on access to safe abortion. So obviously
Right.
there we see the limitations with regard to the use of criminal law. But coming back to the use of criminal law, especially as it relates to FGM, was recently that I served as a trial watch expert supporting the Clooney Foundation as well as the ABA Center for Human Rights, where they were doing for over the past couple of years or so, tracking court cases in Kenya, prosecuting FGM cases within the Kenyan context. And one of the things that came out, unfortunately, though, is that we've seen victims of FGM, the victims that are actually caught, now being prosecuted, right? So that also brings to question around, even as we push for prosecution, right? How do we ensure that procedural mechanisms, right, related to both the investigation and the prosecution and the punishment obviously doesn't quote unquote double harm, right, the victims that
Right,
were already
right.
caught, right?
That it's
Because
not
part of
turned
it is
against
the
them.
limitation around exactly the provisions that said that one could be an accomplice to, like the FGM, right? But I, as a victim, then I am being prosecuted and punished again.
As an
So yeah,
accomplice.
so I mean, exactly
Oh my
right.
goodness.
So yeah, so it's complex as well. But I think there is a lot of intentional thinking being done, especially from the African perspective. Obviously, knowing that even with, as I started at the beginning, even with the naming itself, that there is always a contested debate around why certain practices within the African region are considered FGM, whilst those within quote unquote in Western countries are not. That's another debate by itself as well. But I do think what the conversation that really comes out, especially with regard to the use of criminal law, is really also, as I indicated, not just focusing on a checklist that we have a law, right? But ensuring the other processes to ensuring that the law is enforced is in place, as well as the other approaches that are really vital, right? Especially the empowerment approach, in which girls and women are being empowered in a way that's not just about being able to make decisions about their lives, but also economically as well, which and politically as well, right?
Right,
Because
right.
ensuring that we have women's political participation and representation is vital for the type of laws that we have, but also ensuring that proper budgetary allocation, right, for instance, from government to ensure that they do their part in relation to addressing the issue of FGM is also adhered to. So there are different ways that we should really be thinking about the multisectoral. I know the multisectoral approach is hammered down, but I really do think that being intentional about how we ensure that there are multiple responses that complement each other, right, to addressing the issue of FGM is important. But obviously, as a legal person,
Yeah.
I do, I do want to reiterate that having a law against FGM is vital, but obviously it's not enough by itself.
Thanks for that perspective and these insights. I really appreciate them. And I do want to continue this conversation about, going beyond the use of criminal law to really, as you say,
Right.
really think about community mobilization and also about the range of issues that keep women down, right?
Right.
And foster gender inequality in society that go well beyond particular specific problems like FGM or even child marriage. But it's a range of things like, as you say, economic independence and education and freedom from violence as a whole, political participation. So there's lots of work to do, and I'm
Yes,
glad
there is.
you're engaged in the fight. So thank you so much, Satang. I appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me and for visiting my beautiful country.
Thank you. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure. A luta continua.
La lucha continua. Thanks.